welcome to the show. It's so good to have you. Tell me a little bit more about you. How are you doing, and who are you?
Yeah, thanks, Christian. Thanks for having me here. My name is Volker Buzek. I work as a development architect at a highly specialized tech consultancy called JNS Soft. And more than 3 years ago, we got into contact with WebdriverIO for various reasons, and that we're certainly going to get to. But that's it for me as an introduction of sorts, except I'm also here as an SAP mentor to somehow promote this organization. So for most of you who have probably not heard of the SAP Mentor Program so far, it's a program for recognized individuals from the community that act as a liaison between the community and SAP and try to mitigate between the two. Because obviously sometimes there are differences, sometimes there are opinions to convey. And so we're the group that kind of talks to both.
So even though I grew up in Germany and SAP is a big German tech company, right? I never really got what SAP was doing. So can you just tell really briefly what SAP does and why is it so big?
I think it's most widely known as the synonym for ERP, so Enterprise Resource Planning. You can now coin that any way you want. There's a lot of different opinions about ERP, I think, but the main thing is, in my opinion, SAP provides software to implement business processes across various systems. So it's a lot more business focused in terms of production or human values than, I'd say, a traditional software company that just, in quotes, does software.
Gotcha. And so how does SAP connects to WebdriverIO, or how is WebdriverIO, how are you involved with WebdriverIO?
So there's the strategic UI framework that SAP released more than 10 years ago, so somewhere in 2010, I think. It's called UI5 in short. There's officially SAP UI5 and there's Open UI5, and as the name suggests, there's a closed source or source closed and an open source variant of UI5. So Open UI5 is the big mama, and you've got a small pinnacle of SAP UI5 in there, still being source closed. It's available via an NPM module, so it's not open source, but it's also not closed source. So it's available, but not as open source. So we commonly refer to this as source closed. But still, OpenUI5 is the big framework by SAP that's used throughout the entire product portfolio for web application UI development. And about 3 years ago at my company, JNS Soft, we had the requirement to bring UI5 in a Cordova container onto mobile devices. And of course, enterprise computing somehow also differentiates from, I'd say, other software development efforts by doing lots of testing. And in this case, we tried to look for a framework that we could use for both testing the web application and the Cordova-based application, so the native application on the devices. And pretty quickly, we arrived at WebdriverIO.
Okay, and how do you still remember the question of what framework I need to choose is like very popular. There's a lot of influencer, for a better word of it, that try to get clicks by saying, oh, what framework to choose, and they make a lot of have frameworks fight against each other. But what was your process in making that decision to what framework would be the best for you? Did you look at the requirements? How was the enterprise requirements for you changed, or it influenced the decision on going with WebdriverIO at the end?
Well, first of all, WebdriverIO was the obvious choice because out of the box you have mobile app testing support and also web app testing support that many of the contenders at that time didn't support, such as Playwright and the usual suspects. So that was one thing that put WDIO in the front spot. And another one was when we looked at the contributions and how the core contributors sort of consist themselves from a community perspective. It always has a certain smell to it if you see there's only contributors from one company actually contributing code to a certain framework. I'm not saying this is bad. It's just the thing that sort of is a health indicator, I'd say, for how well the framework actually works in the community and not only for the community. Mm-hmm. And so also the usual suspects, I mean, you can name them. That's Playwright probably. You at that time you simply only had Microsoft contributors from there. Mm-hmm. And well, 3 years ago, you know, the Microsoft didn't reach the level that it now has in terms of reputation to the community as well. So, you know, it had a smell to it. Let's put it this way.
Okay. Another question like that's kind of aligned to that conversation is, and that I have with many people is also the governance aspect, right? Like you have an open source tool that is governed by a company, which can be a good thing because they get a lot of funding. But then we see also negative examples where, you know, the funding stops and then the open source project is there. What did you have similar thoughts around that too, like the governance of an open source project and its importance on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it played a role in the same evaluation process that I just outlined. So it was the community or the contributor diversity along with the governance aspect, I'd say. But even more prominently, I have to say, was also the support of web standards. So for us, it was very, very, very important that if we choose a tool to also extend, that we have something on a base layer available that exclusively recognizes web standards in the implementation. And when we looked under the hood through various other frameworks out there, it was pretty obvious that they took a deviation here and there to achieve something that you just didn't have a good feeling about it. Let's put it this way. Of course, it works, and it obviously works when you use the tool. But if you need to use the tool as a foundation for your own development, then not using standards is at least dangerous, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree with that. I think you speak out of my heart, like being involved myself in developing the WebDriver web standard that makes browser automation happening cross-browser is like something very valuable. And even though there are some, not hacks, but there are ways around it where you don't need to use those web standards and can achieve the same kind of automation, maybe even more. That works, but it's always like, it's not the real thing, right? And I'm very excited about all the developments that currently are going on with the new WebDriver WDi5 standard, the new enhancement on WebDriver on top that will allow a lot of, you know, use cases that hasn't been happening or possible before. So I think WebDriver will catch up with all those kind of things. And very excited about that. How is WebdriverIO then like integrated in WDi5? How does the tool work?
Well, it's funny that you say WDi5 because that was our initial name for it, and we coined it WDi5 exactly for the pronunciation reason.
Okay.
You know, if you have to say WDi5 all the time, sooner or later, as German speakers at least, you know, they're gonna hobble their way into WDi5. Yeah. So we coined it WDi5, and in German it's WDi5, which speaks a lot more fluently as well. Mm-hmm. And with SAP we have let's say a very unique reputation of naming things anyway, so we had to bring some confusion into the naming it. So WDi5 it is. And so it works as a classical extension to WebdriverIO, I'd say. So it is a service to WebdriverIO, but at the same time it uses the so-called record replay of the UI5 library that we originally chose it for, you know, as I explained previously. So at runtime, WebdriverIO is responsible for doing the whole bootstrap stuff of getting the browser going, of establishing the connection to the browser. And then on top, we are doing the API calls to UI5, utilizing the UI5 test API, receiving the calls back and handing stuff back to WebdriverIO. And again, here comes the standards part into play. If for us, it wouldn't have been possible to solely rely on the standards in terms of communication between Node.js scope and browser scope. That would have been a big no-go from the very beginning. So another argument pro WebdriverIO.
Okay.
And also what I wanted to say from the maintenance aspect, that's something else that we didn't really talk about right now, is when you adhere to standards, maintenance gets a whole lot easier. Because you do not have to maintain all your workarounds all the time and, you know, travel along with them over time. In our sector with SAP, even though WDi5 is a community project, but still we're testing business software in quotes. So for ourselves, we kind of level up to the same standards and say maintenance is also important to us. We cannot do and introduce breaking changes all the time. We have to maintain certain functionalities over a long period of time, longer than most other test frameworks probably. So it was just a natural given. Going web standards is the way.
So do you have then also users that have to test all the browsers, or that have still to test an IE, for instance, to make sure their application works?
Yeah, fortunately, we got rid of that about 2 years ago, I think. So when our UI5 library dropped support for IE 11, we at the same time with WDi5 said no more. And so there is no more.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting from a history perspective. So as I outlined, originally we started WDi5 at the company I work for, JNS Soft. And then it was all good and well. So we had the first implementation of WDi5. It worked well with both the web app and the native app. And then time passed by, it worked well for us. And then the big bang happened. And the big bang was that there was another end-to-end testing framework for UI5 in place at the time called WDi5. And it got deprecated by SAP for various reasons, and one of them being a difficulty, I'd say, in the technical architecture. It's sat on top of what's the Angular testing framework? Thank you. Yeah, and it didn't allow for parallel tests, so it only had sequential testing built in, and that was a big problem, of course, if you have large test suites. And for this reason, and for, as I said, various others, SAP said, okay, UI5 is in maintenance mode only. It's sunset. It will not be developed further. But the people have gotten to know from WDi5. And so they approached us and said, you know, how about a community collaboration with SAP and bringing a new test framework in that already exists, that has a certain level of maturity, sponsor the initial development to get UI5 and WDi5 onto feature parity, and then adopt it as the default end-to-end testing framework.
Okay.
And that's exactly what happened. So that was a really cool story, I thought, not only for WebdriverIO, but also for the community aspect between SAP and a larger developer community that solely relies on the open source aspect and the, let's say, friendly collaboration between a big company and, you know, a mass of developers out there. Yeah,
collaboration at the end will win, right? Like you can go fast if you go alone, but you cannot go far if you're alone, right? That's this saying, huh?
Yeah, and it really proved to be true as well. The collaboration between various departments from SAP that work for or with UI5 and the WDi5 community is really excellent to this day. So there's very little friction, you know, from the corporate perspective. Let's put it this way. There's a lot of proactive collaboration for getting things done, for fixing bugs. There is no finger pointing. It's it's collaboration as you define collaboration, I'd say, in that aspect.
So tell me a little bit more about the community. Like, let's say I have a company that has to abstract some business processes with SAP, right? And I have my special requirements. So I have probably like specific SAP plugins to my system, and I want to test those, processes. So I used WDi5 to have an end-to-end test for these processes. So there's a developer in this company then that writes an end-to-end test to make sure that this SAP process works.
Yeah, that's essentially a very good description of how things should work.
And how is then this UI? And so this UI5 basically is like, let's say, React framework, for the better lack of term, that provides you the UI components and UI interfaces to build your SAP application together.
Exactly, the SAP web applications. And I'd say the unique, or the things that stand out when you use UI5 is, for one, you have a complete design system integrated called Fiori. So the UI elements you see on screen are pre-designed in terms of not only visual design, but also in terms of UX for adhering to a design system. So you get that for free, in quotes. You do not have to care a whole lot about styling. And it's also to a very large extent, how do you say it now? I'm missing the term, when it works both on mobile devices, desktop devices. Responsive. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So Jesus. So it's designed in a responsive way as well, so you do not have to care too much about getting UI5 applications run correctly on various screen sizes and various devices. So that's the second thing. And the third thing, of course, is the long-term support for UI5. So, there is for years and years and years, certain versions of UI5 are supported. If you look at the website of UI5, you see maintenance slots that range up until 2034 and stuff. Okay. So that's something for your business users out there, that they can rely on getting support for UI5 applications for a very long time. So this is the React for SAP, let's put it this way, with those three differentiators. And then you have WDi5 for doing the end-to-end testing for those applications, exactly. And with all the power that WebdriverIO brings to the table out of the box, and with on top the little, in quotes, we do to bridge it with UI5, I mean, you have a ballpark right there at your fingertips. And to really run adequate tests across devices, across browsers, across operating systems in a meaningful way. And so I mean, thanks to you, thanks to the entire WebdriverIO community that has such a fantastic tool that we could build upon.
Yeah, that's great to hear. So it makes totally sense, right? When they use SAP software, that they basically have this UI elements that they can click together, and with UI5 they have basically an end-to-end test suite that use WebdriverIO now under the hood, but it helps you also to get your end-to-end tests together, find probably selectors more easily. Like what are the features that the service like adds on top of the usual? Like why would someone not just use the basic WebdriverIO framework? What's the WDi5 adding to the game?
I think most prominently is that we proxy all API methods of the UI5 controls in the browser to Node.js scope and vice versa. So meaning, as you've already said, the selectors or locators, as we call them in this WDi5 context, they're native to UI5. So if you're a UI5 developer, coming up with a selector looks super familiar to you. There's nothing that you need to relearn. And then once you have that control programmatically identified, you can use all API methods from that UI5 control in the Node.js scope.
Okay. So you control UI elements within Node.js then in some way?
Yep, exactly. And so there's an API alignment between UI5 and WDi5, in parentheses, WebdriverIO. And so again, there's very little friction for you as a developer to then write the tests, because you can just use those so-called controls in the UI5 universe as if you would code in the browser. You can use the same APIs in the Node.js tests. And that, of course, is a quick win, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great developer experience then, right? When it feels all work together, right? Like as if it's one environment, really.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the main selling point that WDi5 has in terms of features. All the rest is sort of all taken from WebdriverIO and twisted a little here and there. For example, the authentication part. So we support various authentication mechanisms from basic auth up to a custom SAP identity provider. But under the hood, that's only in quotes WebdriverIO scripts running that surface the login methods unique to the SAP infrastructure, I'd say.
And yeah, those are things that you cannot just everyone could use. It's very SAP specific, right?
Yeah. So especially the sign-in process with the business technology platform, or BTP in short, there's a standard identity provider behind this that per default serves all the BTP instances out there. And in WDi5, you have just a custom login mechanism for this. You only need to provide 2 environment variables, your username and your password, obviously, and off you go. You do not have to care about scripting anything, log in now, press button now, wait now, or so. You can just authenticate, and that's it.
Interesting. And you know, this is being used then to test not only for desktop but also for web mobile. And is there a native mobile part as well?
No, not yet, or not anymore, more precisely. As I said in the beginning, so we developed WDi5 to support both mobile and both native and web apps. And at some point in time, when we had the sponsored development by SAP for WDi5, they said no more native support, because they had their own SAP mobile services in place. And they have their own SDKs in place for Android, for iOS, and there was no point in us doing another iteration of supporting mobile testing in the SAP universe. So they said concentrate on the web app part, and that's valid up to this point to today. So we're only in quotes supporting the web testing and not the native app testing. But still, I've seen colleagues from another low-code, company that have used WDi5 and re-plugged in the old native app support. And so they put together the new version of WDi5 with an old code base, and they still use it to test native applications. So technically, it seems to be still possible, but it's not on our feature agenda currently.
How do folks then, do they test on mobile then, or do they just do something else?
No, they obviously test on mobile, and I know this because there's recently been an issue from some person using WDi5 who said that there's some strange error happening in the iOS browser on the iPhone, something else. So they obviously use some sort of cloud testing service, I think Browser Stack or Sauce Labs or so, and they use WDi5 as the bridge to run the tests on those platforms. Okay. So yeah, and as I said, you have UI5 that supports in a responsive way running on various devices, and then with WDi5, of course, it's just the same way we reuse certain functionality from UI5, and that is also one of those. So If it runs on a mobile device in the browser of a mobile device, then you can test it with WDi5.
So do you probably have like maintaining WDi5, you probably get a lot of feature requests. What would what would you like to see within WebdriverIO that could support WDi5 users in the future? Like, what would you like to see, being added to the core framework?
Actually, there's already a lot of stuff on the plate that we could pick up. So, for example, the new component testing feature that you introduced with WebDriver 8. So I think we should be able to reuse this in WDi5 as well for taking the actual and also by the same name known component from UI5 and run it with the help of WebdriverIO in the browser. But it's a question of time. So WDi5 is a community project. It's been transferred from a sponsored development into a community open source project with a governance and steering committee board. And as you probably know, participation and collaboration is the biggest thing there. And it's a question of time. So there currently, I do not know of anybody who's picked up that WebdriverIO version 8 feature and tried to make that browser component testing run with UI5 yet, even though it should be technically possible.
Yeah, I think there shouldn't be many problems to integrate it because it's a little bit just different how the test being executed. But essentially services work in the same way. So right now you could plug in a source app service and it would still do all the things that it would do for end-to-end tests, but WebdriverIO would just run the test in the browser, right?
No. Yeah, so as I said, you put a lot of stuff out there on the table, and if we pick up all of that, I think our agenda is already full. We're still lagging behind with the WebDriver version 8 enablement in WDi5, so we are currently on version 7 only. And that's also only a question of time and resources.
Gotcha. Yeah, everything takes a little time. We're, I think, at the end. Are there any closing remarks that you have that you want to get with, like anything you want to plug or you want to tell people?
Actually, I want to thank you and the entire WebdriverIO community for not only delivering such a fantastic tool, but also to be so open and friendly and approachable. That's something I always hope for, because I know it from the collaboration with the UI5 colleagues from SAP. But now having it refound sort of in you and the WebdriverIO community is fantastic. And I'd like to, sort of extend or reach out and welcome everybody to get to know WebdriverIO, get to know the tool and the community around it, because it really feels nice working with it, not only from a technical perspective.
That's good to hear. Yeah, I think the team puts a lot of work into creating this friendly environment, and I think it's all about collaborating with each other and making each other successful. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was very insightful. I've looked into WDi5 a couple of times. Never really got because I never used it. We never really understood how it works. It's good to hear from basically the creator, from the creator of it. So thank you for showing us your world. And thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day. Bye.